Stephen Bourne, thank you for talking to us. Can you tell me a little bit about your book, Black Poppies? What's it about?
Black Poppies focuses on the experiences of black soldiers in the First World War, those who served for Britain, and also the wider black community that existed in Britain at that time. So it's a kind of celebratory book that acknowledges the contribution that black servicemen and the black community made to the First World War.
How many previous books have been written about the work of black servicemen in Britain?
There haven't been any books really that have dealt with this subject in any depth. There have been some books about Walter Tull, who's alleged to be the first black British officer in the British Army. Children's books especially have been published about Walter Tull. He's quite an important figure in my own book, but I felt that Walter Tull had been given a certain amount of attention in various books and magazine articles and on the internet. But I wanted to put him in a context, in a black context if you like, with other black soldiers and the wider black community, because he was British born as well. And that was really one of my aims for the book.
So you've talked about him. Are there any other people that inspired your book?
There were in the course of researching the book and finding these stories, yes, there were quite a number of inspiring stories. One that I uncovered was the story of Norman Manley, a Jamaican who came from a kind of middle-class Jamaican background and was a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford. So he was part of that elite, but he went to Oxford to study around the time the war broke out in 1914. So he joined up, he left Oxford and joined up and joined the British Army. And see, one of the myths that I've blown or tried to blow in the book is that we were like the Americans, that we segregated black soldiers from white soldiers. Well, we didn't do that. That's what makes the story so intriguing, because it's like a new insight into this history. Black soldiers like Norman Manley joined British regiments up and down the country. There is evidence, and more evidence is coming through. But Norman's experiences were documented by him in a kind of autobiographical piece that he wrote that was published after he died in the Jamaica Journal, which I was able to access, where he went into great detail about his career in the British Army in World War I. And in a nutshell, what happened was he found great comradeship with the rank and file, the ordinary foot soldiers, who he called them the Cockneys, and they adored him and he adored them. It was the white officers class, the higher up ranks, that he came into conflict with and actually turned down promotion in the army because of their racist attitudes.
You mentioned how the rank and file soldiers didn't have any issues with the black soldiers, but there was an issue with some of the officers. Why, in general, though, do you think the British approach was different from the American approach?
I think the British were different to the Americans in that, in the kind of massive recruitment campaign that took place at the beginning of the First World War, some recruiting officers would have been discouraged by the army and the British government in accepting black recruits. But it didn't filter down to all of them. And a historian friend of mine pointed out something very interesting. He said that if you had a black guy from Liverpool or a village in England somewhere that went with his white friends to a recruiting office to be recruited for the army, the recruiting officer would not have turned him away, because it would have lowered the morale of his white friends. And I think that's why a number of black men were able to join British regiments and integrate. The problem is we don't know the numbers. In America, they would have recorded ethnicity. In Britain, we didn't. So when people say to me, how many black soldiers were there, I can't give them an answer. Because we never, and also when people say to me, how many black people lived in Britain, we don't know. Because the census of 1911, for example, which was 3 years before the war started, doesn't record ethnicity like it did in America. So we can't come to accurate figures.
Do you, though, think it could have been in the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands?
I don't know. You can't put a number on it. And even since the book's been published, it has generated an interest in people looking for black faces in British regiments, and more photographic evidence is coming forward.
So do you think black soldiers in Britain have been given the recognition they deserve?
Absolutely not. I mean, black soldiers, even Walter Tull, who's kind of the best known black soldier in Britain in the First World War, was only rediscovered about 15 years ago. He'd been completely forgotten. Like Mary Seacole, the Jamaican nurse from the Crimea War. Completely forgotten and ignored and sidelined by historians. Historians in this country, the way I explain it to young people, particularly young black people, who ask me this question, and the only way I can explain it is to say that traditionally historians in Britain have been Oxford and Cambridge, white middle-class men. Some women, but mostly white middle-class men. So they have their own perspective on British history, and that does not include black people. So that's why I think that this story has been obliterated from the history books.
So what extent do you think your book will give them more recognition?
It cracks open the subject. That's all I intended it to do. I did not intend this book to be definitive. There wasn't the funding for that. There wasn't the time for that. I wanted this book published in time for the centenary, which was August the 4th, 2014. And if I'd had more time, if I'd had more resources, if I'd had more finance, I hopefully could have done a book that was more substantial. So all I could do in the time I was given and with the restraints on me was to crack the subject open and hopefully open a door for other people to do more research. It's not a definitive book. It couldn't ever be. It's too thin for a start to be definitive. So that's what I was hoping would happen, and I think it has. In some ways.
When you began writing the book, did you have any perceptions that changed as you wrote it?
All the time. All the time I was uncovering more and more stories and doing the more and more research, and it was very difficult to uncover some of this information because there was so little information around. The Norman Manley story was easy because he'd published those memoirs of the First World War in Jamaica Journal, but with someone like Herbert Morris, the young Jamaican lad who was shot at dawn at the age of 16, very difficult to get the detail. But then I did access his papers from the National Archives. I managed to track down the original papers of Herbert Morris's court-martial, the wonderful testimonials that were given to him by his senior officers, and they still shot him for desertion. But he was pardoned in 2006. So uncovering that particular story moved me deeply, and was very, very sad to uncover such a story. But it fitted into the book perfectly because he was Jamaican.
The book covers such a diverse range of topics. How on earth do you go about researching such a topic?
They're threads. When you start, they're just threads. They're just threads in the air and in your books and in your mind and in papers that you collect over the years. I didn't just research this overnight. This is like years and years and years and years and years of collecting stuff. Not necessarily intending it to go into a book. It's just what I do. I collect like a magpie. I collect stuff. I'm a detective. I try and find out more stories. When you're given the opportunity to put it all into a book, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got all the correct information. But there are threads, and you pull them all together and you put them under a title called Black Poppies, and you hope that it all fits together. I never believed for 1 minute that this book fitted together as a story. There wasn't the time to think it through in that way. I just put my hands together and prayed that it would work. And almost immediately, people, when the book was published, were ringing me or emailing me, friends or people on Facebook and social media, saying what a wonderful book. Not because I think it's particularly wonderfully written. I don't think I'm the greatest writer in the world, but I can string stories together and make sense of them and make them interesting, and that's all I can do.
Stephen, how did you gain an interest in black history?
Very simply, I was raised in a predominantly white working class family from London, and in that family I had an older relative who was a black woman born in London in 1912, before the First World War, who was adopted into my family in the Second World War. And as I was growing up, I was very interested in the stories of my older relatives, like my grandparents, my great aunts and uncles, and I would go and visit all these relatives when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, as young as I was. And then that would include talking to Aunt Esther. Later on, we did a book together about her life, which was published, the first book I ever had published, which was in 1991. But I stored up lots of stories from her that weren't necessarily in the book that we did together. So there was plenty of material to use about her childhood in the First World War, which is why there's a chapter about her in the Black Poppies book. But that's what started my interest, and it grew from there. It wasn't just about her. As I grew older, I began to read more widely about the existence of black people in Britain. But I was always questioning history whenever I saw it represented in television documentaries or read about it in books. Why were black people missing from British histories? And because I knew of her existence and knew there were others like her. But over time I was able to fit that jigsaw together.
Stephen Bourne, thank you very much.
You're welcome.